This month, our guest speaker for the Interreligious Network for Worker Solidarity is Dr. Joerg Rieger, founding director of the Wendland Cook Program in Religion and Justice at Vanderbilt University. For more information, find us on the web at www.in4ws.org.
Thank you, Joe. It's really a pleasure to be with this group. This is a group I greatly admire. I've been at some of the past meetings, and I really think what you are doing here is not just important, but it may be essential to the future, not only of the country, but also of religion. And that's what I want to talk about, how faith and labor ultimately interact and reshape each other. Because I think this is where some of the work has to be done yet, and where some constructive work can be done. I'm directing, I'm a professor of constructive theology at Vanderbilt Divinity School, and I'm directing this program called the Wendland Cook Program in Religion and Justice, which is really the only program of its kind that I'm aware of, not only in the country, but really globally, that puts together labor and theology in terms of theological education. So we're really in the business of training, ministers, pastors. A lot of our students also turn out to be organizers and activists. And to do this work constructively with a theological bend is actually quite unusual. We have a lot of focus these days in theological education on issues of race, racism, gender, sexism, ethnicity, and so on, identities. But not so much on questions of economics, and specifically economics and labor. And then, of course, also the question of labor includes tough questions that no one wants to talk about, like questions of class and so on. This is some of the work I've done in my own research. I just finished a new manuscript over the weekend that's titled Theology in the Capitalocene, Ecology, Identity, Class, and Solidarity. So that's sort of the academic piece of the work that we're doing. But we do a lot of work at the Wendland Cook Program that's also related to popular education. So if you're interested in that, check out our website. Francisco will put a few things in the chat. There's webinars on faith and labor issues. There's a blog series called Interventions. We're starting a new continuing education series called Exchanges, and so on. So that's some of the work that we're doing. And today I want to talk specifically about the challenges of faith and labor, sort of as they go together and challenge each other. Now, I know that many of you are veterans in this work, so I'm not here to tell you things that you don't know, but I want to push maybe some buttons, and I'm really interested in getting your assessment and your responses. So for me, this is really not just sort of a one-way street, but I want to learn. And hopefully connecting many and, if not all of you with the Wendland Cook Program, and also have your experience as resources. So in some ways, I'm preaching to the choir here, but I think these are some of the issues. As you know, though, many Americans would be surprised that there are even connections between labor and faith, right? This is something that's not talked about in our faith communities a lot. I'm specifically, of course, talking about Christianity, but that also really goes for interfaith, because I don't see it happen a lot, except in very specific places. At the same time, as many of you know, most of the mainline faith traditions at some place in their documents or even in their theological statements are supporting labor, collective bargaining, and so on. I'm a Methodist. It's right there in our social principles. And many of the other religious communities have that also. And many of the interfaith traditions have it. It's just that the membership is usually not aware, or if they're aware, they think this is somewhat, a special interest issue that's for some specialists, but not really for the majority. Even though we know that 99% of us are working for a living, and therefore, in one way or another, belong to what Michael Zweig has once called the working class majority, right? The working class is not a minority. It's not a few people that struggle, but it's most of us even though, of course, those of us in the middle think we're not workers, or some weird conception here. So in a way, we're doing this work. It has a long history. But there was a lot more going on 100 years ago than now. So we think of this as modern progressive times. It really isn't. In some ways, this is probably as bad a shape as, we have been in a long time, even though now things are picking up, as we all know, with Striketober and so on. But I remember many years ago when I was starting to do some of this work, talking to an experienced labor organizer saying, I'm working on faith and labor. And she said to me, good luck. You're dealing with two dying organizations. Well, labor and the churches, right? Two dying organizations. And sometimes it feels that way. Let me talk about some of the problems, and then I want to talk about the potential that I see. The problems I find in the faith and labor work that many of us are doing is that religion and labor often run on parallel but separate tracks. Thereby, we miss the opportunity to learn from each other. And really, the relationship oftentimes lacks the energy that a deeper relationship could bring. So, what would happen if you really built relationships that go deeper than just running along on separate tracks? You all know the talk about rent a collar or rent a congregation. That's, of course, the mode in which some of this work is happening, sometimes out of necessity. I'm not blaming anybody. I'm just observing what we're often doing. And so a lot of what's happening with faith and labor could be classified as mobilizing, which is good, better mobilizing than nothing. But it's not organizing. It's not going to that deeper level. And so no real solidarity is emerging. Even the way we sometimes talk about this, how do we help working people as people of faith or something like that, without realizing that 99% of us are actually somehow implicated in work. And we spend the bulk of our waking hours at work. Keep that in mind also. This is why labor is so important. It's not just a social issue that's about wages and benefits, but it shapes us deeply. It shapes our cultures. It shapes our religions to the core in a way that we're not even aware of. It shapes our democracy to the core. If you go to work and there is no democracy, well, if you don't have economic democracy, can you really have a political democracy? Those are some of the questions that could be fruitfully addressed. But right now, I think we're not really talking about that in either of the camps. We're just running, mobilizing, sometimes very successfully, to be sure. But I'm wondering what more is possible, what's being missed here. So this is where I want to talk about the two things now. Labor, religion needs labor, and labor needs religion. That's the topic really we're dealing with in this little book, Unified, We're a Force. I think Francisco put that in the chat earlier. So let me talk first about why religion actually needs labor. So this is not just a marriage of convenience where you say, oh, we're having some common concerns, but I'm actually arguing that religion needs labor because it reminds us of the deep religious concerns for the flourishing of working people. You see that all throughout the Abrahamic traditions, for sure. That's right, Abrahamic traditions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. I've done some work with engaged Buddhists also, and it's very interesting. Difficult for American engaged Buddhists to see this, but a lot of the Asian engaged Buddhists, they're all involved in labor movements, not so much the U.S. engaged Buddhists. And what I'm saying is as religion gets involved in labor, it becomes aware of some things within its own traditions that it didn't see. So let's talk about God here. I'm a theologian, right? Let me talk a bit about God at least. In the Abrahamic traditions, surprise is that God is not just supportive of working people, but God is oftentimes envisioned as a working person, or at least as in solidarity with working people. And that changes something right there. If you think about God, not so much as a king or as a CEO, which is sort of the default position for most people, but think about God as sort of involved in labor, working. God self gets the divine hands dirty. This is, by the way, part of the creation stories that both Judaism, Christianity, and Islam share, where God forms Adam from clay, from dust, right? And what's interesting here is God not putting some workers to get their hands dirty, but God gets the divine hands dirty, as it were. God then plants a garden. Again, God's the one who gets the divine hands dirty. Then you have the Exodus from Egypt. That's also there in all three Abrahamic traditions, where Moses is not just a religious leader, but a labor leader, right? A labor-inspired faith leader or a religious labor leader, whatever you want to call it. And what you have here is a real solidarity story, because Moses grows up as a rich kid in Pharaoh's court. He gets conscientized. He reacts in the wrong way because he kills one of the slave masters. And then sort of going through the school of organizing, emerging at the burning bush at the end, Moses realizes that God's actually not on the side of the Pharaoh, but God's on the side of the slaves. That's a pretty surprising discovery. And I'm saying religion has to reclaim some of these things. You may think those are all just primitive, maybe symbolic images. I'm arguing this is actually at the heart, at the core of these traditions. And unless you reclaim it, you might miss your traditions altogether. So God in the Exodus stories actually joins in solidarity. God is not the one who's watching from a distance, sitting on a throne, presenting the divine aseity or neutrality, but God's in the struggle. And that, I often say, is the real miracle of the burning bush. Not that there's a bush that doesn't get consumed while it's burning, but that God joins on the side of the people. Imagine what that would do for some of our religious awareness and consciousness. And then if you go take this to Christianity specifically, you see this again. Jesus also is a labor-inspired faith leader. Concern for the well-being of fishermen, construction workers, day laborers, women and men working in fields. In the most recent Jesus research, Richard Horsley, for instance, has made it very clear Jesus was an organizer. Not just a preacher, not just a pious person, not just a ritualist, but an organizer who builds people power. That changes something right there in your images of Jesus. And if you read some of the radical images of Jesus that were published 100 years ago and more, it's already right there. It's just we completely forgot about that. We have to reclaim it. And once we do, something changes within religion itself. That to me is the beauty of connecting religion with labor. And I speak as a theologian. I think this is work that has to be done in the religious communities themselves. If you ever want to get beyond mobilizing and bringing some well-meaning priests, pastors, and religious people out on the picket lines. Now, once you do that, I think the whole gamut of religion really becomes not only much more lively, but certainly more energetic and so on. Labor, in other words, here helps us reclaim religious heritage. And that's, I just used the three Abrahamic traditions. You can make similar arguments for any other religion also. Like I said, been working with Buddhists. Confucianism is a really interesting tradition in that regard also, that can either be a religion of the status quo or a religion of the people. And the two are really very different from each other. The result here is a deep reshaping of religious communities themselves. So this is now building faith from the ground up. It also has implications for how you organize within religion. Don't just think of organizing as a labor task, think of organizing as organizing faith communities. And now it's not a top-down move anymore where you have a couple of enlightened religious professionals or leaders. It's now a matter of actually thinking from the bottom up and wondering what it is, that the grassroots membership can do. Union language, we talk about the rank and file. Those people now become agents. Those people now, their faith matters, their agency matters. And that gets energized by, this wake-up call that comes to religion from labor, rethinking everything all the way to how you think about God, Jesus Christ, the Holy Spirit, the church, ideas like salvation, sin, and evil, the whole dogmatics, really. Let me push on here real fast because time is short. Let me talk a bit more about the other side, how labor also needs religion. I think this is the other problem that we're really having, that labor, of course, is very happy to have support, but oftentimes, we're a bit, as people of faith, I speak as a person of faith here myself, we're a bit like the cheap date. People that want to do well and that really mean well and they want to do something worthwhile socially. That is not enough. So labor really needs to realize that religion needs to be more than a cheap date. Uh, as you all know, this is not anything new that I'm telling you. Labor is beginning to realize for the last couple of years, and this is a really good movement, that we need to build deeper relationships with the broader community. This is the work that Bargaining for the Common Good is doing. It's really crucial. It's really the right kind of direction. And I think in this work, religion is absolutely necessary. Now, of course, I'm here in Nashville, Tennessee. That's where Vanderbilt is. So we're in the Southeast, one of the most religious parts of the country. But I think it works same in other places around the country too. We're beginning to realize that religion is this deep community-based entity where churches, synagogues, mosques, and temples are not only places where the community meets, but also places where organizing happens almost naturally. And of course, sometimes the religious professionals don't get it. They think all they have to do is, keep up business as usual instead of organizing and going deeper. But the communities know it, and that's part of the potential that I see. Of course, there's a lot of right-wing organizing going on if you pay attention to it, but there can also be progressive organizing that needs to happen. And sometimes the liberals miss that. The liberals are not that good oftentimes with organizing. And of course, we're not talking about liberals and conservatives. We're talking about liberationist perspectives. We're talking about another sort of progressive push that comes from the working class, from labor, from working people. That's something that neither certainly not the big parties get, but also the culture wars oftentimes overlook. So faith communities here as places where organizing happens, where different values are held. This is my second point. This is crucial also. Different values from the dominant system, where the dignity of all people counts instead of the profit. Where care for each other counts instead of exploiting each other for personal gain. That's certainly part of the bedrock that we have to recover. What I want to emphasize here, and this may come a bit as a surprise, I believe that religion is really also the place for understanding and building deeper relationships of solidarity. This is what in the book I have called deep solidarity. The problem, I think, with a misunderstood notion of solidarity is that, to a lot of people today, it means like marching in lockstep, everybody speaking in the same voice, or if you go with the philosophical debates, it's sort of notions of identity, sameness, and so on, that get really problematic when you talk about solidarity, because it doesn't respect difference, it doesn't respect a broader perspective. And so paying attention to religious diversity, I think, is a first step into moving into a different sort of solidarity. And here I want to talk specifically about interreligious relationships. One of the problems I see with well-meaning organizers that are using religion in positive ways is that they are not either really aware of what religion is or what the religious differences are. And so well-meaning statements like all religions believe in justice are fine, are great. And this still is an important statement. I believe it. The problem with it is that once you say it, the assumption is we're all the same. We already know what we mean by justice. All religions are the same, blah, blah, blah. What you're losing is the actual energy that each religious tradition could bring to you when they talk about justice, because not all religious traditions mean exactly the same thing. In the Abrahamic traditions, justice is very strongly emphasizing taking sides. One side over the other, right? Not neutrality. That's a very strong notion in the Abrahamic traditions. If you don't get that, you're missing something. In the Buddhist traditions, justice might be more tied to questions of relationship and reconciliation. But there's something else comes in that you're missing if you assume you basically have justice figured out. Justice is somehow, minimum wage for everybody or something like that. That's not radical enough. That's not strong enough, and is not powerful enough, really, to build this coalition long term. So here, deep solidarity reminds us that we're stronger the more diverse we are. That sounds strange, but diversity here is actually our secret power, that we bring different understandings that don't have to be brought together at the end and somebody saying, well, we're all alike and whatnot, but we can actually build from our diversities. And then we can have real conversations. That's the beauty of the interreligious work. We now can really see how we're similar, but also how we're different and what we can learn from each other. You can play the same scenario when you think about racial and gender differences. Another important thing, we really have to understand that solidarity as solidarity in diversity needs not only to respect racial and gender differences, but needs to employ them for the common good. And that means that oftentimes the leadership goes precisely to those minorities that otherwise all we want to do is include into the dominant status quo. So deep solidarity gets built from the other end, from the bottom up. So this is some of the work, I'll end here. This is some of the work we do at the Wendland-Cook program in Religion and Justice, where labor and religion ultimately, are brought together in a conversation where we dare to ask the uncomfortable questions of each other, not because we want to make people feel bad, but because we think we could be stronger. We could actually build our causes if each of us went deeper. And at the heart here is, of course, the notion of solidarity, a deep concern for community and the well-being of the many, not just a few. Keep in mind too, this is the big outcome here, that at a time when we think about, alternative politics, mainly as minority politics, we now have to remind ourselves, faith and labor together, that we're not a minority. We're not talking about, just a few people asking some special interest of the system. We are the majority of the population. If we play it right, if we think about it, can define and redefine what common interest is. So this is not a special interest deal. It's really ultimately the common interest deal. And this is the kind of work I think we still have to do. So I'll end here, and I'm curious about your questions.
Thank you so much, Joerg. Inspiring. We have time for questions and comments. Floor is open. Mike.
Thank you, Joerg. I thought that was an excellent presentation. There seems to be on some more conservative faith expressions like the evangelical movement and some others, and a growing awareness of how much the last 40 years of neoliberal economics, the toll that has taken on family life, and they're beginning to get more active in issues like paid family leave and so forth. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that, or any information, or where you see that could be heading. Thank you.
That's a really great question, because it points out something else that I didn't say, but that's really crucial here. When we think about the landscape within Christianity, the assumption usually is it's say evangelicals versus liberals or something like that. And the reality is, in my own work, and I've done this for a long time, so 15, 20 years or so. What I have seen, I've done, my wife and I, who co-authored the Unified We're Force book, did a lot of this work in Dallas, Texas for about 15 years. And what we saw there is that oftentimes the evangelicals were more excited about labor issues than the liberals. Well, part of it is because an evangelical already knows you have to take sides. It's not sort of some wishy-washy, middle-of-the-road position, we have to love everybody. No, we have to take sides. We have to make a decision, the personal decision thing that you get in evangelical. So there's sort of a predisposition already in evangelical minds. And plus, if you can make a strong argument based on the Bible, they want to take the Bible seriously. Sometimes the liberals are not so sure, oh, well, I don't like this or I don't like that. Don't want to knock the liberals here. I just want to open a different door here in the evangelical traditions. Now, that's sort of the overall theological situation. The specific question that you raised is, once you can help, say, in an evangelical tradition or in other more conservative traditions, show that capitalism actually is not your friend, that what's going on here is not supporting American values, family values, or democracy for that matter, you've already made a big difference. And these are arguments, I think the time is right, more and more people realize how serious these things are. One reason why I, as a theological scholar, am engaging labor issues is because labor shapes us so deeply. Labor affects everything. We spend the bulk of our waking hours there, I said earlier, and therefore it shapes the way we think, the way we relate to each other. It shapes our families. It shapes family structures. And so the more you can help everybody see that, I think the better that is. That's also the thing for interfaith relations. The relation here is not between any and all faiths, whatever, but it is always trying to figure out where are the potential in the various faith traditions for progressive movements. So Christianity in general is not your friend, but it's a progressive sort of Christianity that tries to take its roots seriously. Sometimes that's evangelicals, sometimes that's different people, and the same in other religious traditions. If we talked about Judaism, it's the same thing. You have some really progressive Jewish traditions and very time-honored. We have a representative here, right, or more. And then you have other traditions that are really just empire traditions. So that's sort of the struggle. And the more we can see it, I think the more we can work with it. So that's why that question is so important.
Thank you, Joerg. Ty?
Thank you, Joerg. One of the things I've been wrestling with, so I'm a Catholic priest. I'll just speak from that perspective. I've been a pastor or an associate pastor my whole time. I've been very involved with the labor movements here in Baltimore. And I feel like we in the church spaces or religious spaces are living with some deep contradictions that impact, I think, the ways theology can help us, or I think theology can. Here's the problem, is that we are employers and employees, we are workplaces ourselves. And so few, if any, of our workplaces within religious spheres are organized themselves or allowed to be organized or not sort of fought by the same religious, it's like a fight from within in some cases. It's the preaching of our bishops write beautiful statements about Labor Day and the right of workers to organize. And yet that right is kind of suppressed within religious workspaces. And I would have thought maybe of all times, the COVID times would open that up. But what I found is that like here locally anyway, I don't know if this resonates with anybody else in your traditions or what you're seeing from your perspective, but like even COVID times, we just had a meeting yesterday with our Archbishop, our priest council, and they're concerned about the number of teachers and teachers' aides and Catholic school employees resigning and quitting. And there was no analysis that this might be exactly related. The reasons why might be why so many workers have felt alienated from the workforce because of the conditions of work and the pay and et cetera. So I don't know. I would love to hear more about maybe, or if there's a place, maybe your book about on the real practical side, where I think that's another facet of how church needs labor in a very real way. I understand the rent-a-collar perspective, maybe on the other side of it, but I think I think we're still not fully there yet because I feel like there was more organizing happening in the past, but in the for too many decades now, the church sometimes stands as antagonist to organizing.
I think that's exactly right, Ty. So thanks for that comment. And by the way, the same is really true for the universities too. I mean, when I came to Vanderbilt, and I've only been here about 5 or 6 years, I taught at SMU in Dallas for the previous 20-some. When I first came, the adjuncts were organizing, and Vanderbilt, sort of like this typical liberal academic institution it is, sort of played along for a while, but really employed all the strategies and tactics of union busting. And so the effort wasn't successful. And what was so sad about it was that the tenured professors, and of course, the higher you go, right? I have a name chair and whatnot. My colleagues, they had no idea that they were affected by this. I mean, of course, we weren't affected because we have tenure and but it's a question of whose side are you on and whose power are you ultimately wielding? And I had to remind my colleagues, if the chancellor makes $3 million and the janitor makes 30,000, who do you think you're closer to, right? Even if you're doing quite well. So a lot of times it's the leadership, it's the pastors, it's the professors, it's the bishops that assume that they have more in common with the ruling class than with the working class, which is, of course, a false assumption. So that's a very easy math game you can do, but you can also do a power analysis. You can see it. That's where the theology comes in. I mean, I submit to you, and I really have not been proven wrong by anybody, that most people, well-meaning people, assume that God is closer to the ruling class than to the working class. And that is a default assumption that ultimately shapes everything, because it also shapes faith. Is a matter of, who do you pay allegiance to? Who do you align yourself with? Who do you relate to? Who are you responsible to? The assumption is we're responsible to up, not down. And this is why you have a lot of well-meaning people doing these things. So the theology is wrong here. And I think that does a lot of damage. And for people of faith, I think that is one of the biggest struggles. Now, I'm not arguing for an easy identification of God and the working class. But raising this question and doing some of this work, I think could also go a long way to say, you just fired Jesus here. you just cut the benefits of Jesus. Would you really want to do that? So it's those kinds of almost Sunday school-like questions I think could be very helpful.
Joerg triggered a lot. Joerg, you've really triggered a lot of discussion in the chat, and I know people are in line to want to say things, and yet we have so little time. So let me just recognize a few people to briefly put their question on the table, and then we'll ask you for a final thought, Joerg.
Right.
As I see it, Gail, Jean, and James, could I ask you to briefly say what you wanted, Gail? Yep, you're muted, Gail.
Really quickly, one thing I do want to say is that we in New Hampshire, as a budding Faith and Labor Coalition, have had Joerg in twice. And in 2019, when he first presented before us, it really was the kickoff to helping people understand from both the faith and labor communities what the nexus is and what the potential is. So I just, I want to give a shout out to Joerg. But I'm really struck, Joerg, by what you said about faith and labor together are not a minority, and we should start acting that way. So not for today, but if you can think about some really specific examples, real life things that exemplify faith and labor coming together and with a consciousness and acting like a majority, I would love, I would love to have those kinds of resources and stories.
Thanks.
So thank you.
Thank you, Gail. Jean, briefly.
Yes, Pope Francis has been really stressing the role of conversion. And my question has to do with where does that fit into this organizing, not just individually, but institutionally?
Yeah.
Okay, and James. James?
Actually, I'm Holly Beaumont, Reverend Holly Beaumont.
I'm sorry.
I'm on my husband's computer, unfortunately. Mine's in the shop.
Holly.
So I just want to say, Joerg, you're my hero. You have been for years. Thank God that you have the voice that you have and the insight. Your critique of Genesis is just brilliant, and I will use it and bring you back to New Mexico. My question is, Lawrence Lessing, years ago, he's a professor at Harvard Law School, coined the term dependence corruption, and he applied it to Congress. I personally think it applies to most walks of life in the United States, including congregations who are nervous about preaching, teaching, sharing messages that they think will threaten the offering plate. And it's a real, I mean, when a Unitarian minister says to me, don't allow anything at this event that might offend our Trump supporters, then I know we're in trouble. And it goes right down to our pocketbooks.
Thanks, Holly. So Joerg, final thoughts in response to these?
Yes, let me start from the back here with Holly's comment about corruption. Usually when we talk about corruption, we talk about who's being corrupted. We don't always talk about who's doing the corrupting, right? And so in this case, I think it's pretty obvious. There's a class struggle in our religious communities, and that's not unintentional. It's not just that money rules and wins, but money is in some ways organized in ways that working people are not. And I have seen specifically, even progressive churches being strong-armed by a few organized, well-situated conservative members. So keep that in mind when you think about how we fight back. It really takes this organizing with a clear idea: whose side are you on, and who is on the other side, and what's the work that we have to be doing. So that's one comment here about the dependency corruption. Of course, if working people organized in a church, think of this in terms of the big donors. If working people organize and put their money together, they might have as much money to give as the individual person that you don't want to piss off. And if the priest or the pastor then would have to make a choice, you want to go with this one or 25 people in a Sunday school class who are actually organizing and threatening to walk if you do not engage labor at all, which most churches don't, they really just don't, then you have a different situation. So that's one thing you could do here. That might also go to Gail's question. How do you work as a majority? Well, in a church, you have to make it clear there's more of us than them. That's really true. I mean, most churches that I know, they may have some wealthy donors, and they may have, I could tell you about really wealthy churches, but there's still more working people than the rest. And once you sort of start organizing, it's not so much important what your priest thinks, but it's really important what the community does. And for people to identify in this way, you have a different game. So that's within a congregation, but think of it within a political context. Think of it, say in local politics. If all of a sudden you have a conversation on economic democracy, where you realize that political democracy is grounded there, and that working people, it's not just about benefits and wages, it's about voice and power. Working people now are waking up, realizing that they do have a voice and that they do have power. It can be, and I know many of you would probably have examples for what that looks like, so I don't want to go into that. But the final question about conversion, I think, is perhaps the most crucial one. That's an old evangelical term. I grew up as a German Methodist, by the way. I'm still a Methodist, ordained clergy also. Conversion was the biggest thing for us, except that we thought of conversion as some mind game, where you somehow love Jesus more now than before. But conversion in the Hebrew traditions is a very practical thing. You walk in one direction, you turn around, you go the other direction. So conversion is not so much mind games, but changing relationships, changing lives based on organizing, all that stuff comes together. And so one thing we're doing also with Faith in Labor, I haven't mentioned, we work here with the Southeast Center of Cooperative Development, Worker Co-op Development Center that works with minorities, building minority power. And one of the big things in worker co-ops is the term conversion, where you're converting traditional businesses to worker co-ops. And I think there's no better image for conversion than that, because it's really turning everything around, fitting into the capitalist economy to really creating alternative economies. If the labor movement would think about conversion, I think that would also be very powerful, because too oftentimes, we thought about labor just as tempering maybe the worst excesses of capitalism. What if labor was actually something that could help convert a neoliberal capital economy into something else, right? And finally, for religious people, what if conversion really meant if you were now no longer the same, your solidarities change, your relationships change, and you're really following Jesus for a change instead of Caesar. That's, by the way, the topic of one of my recent books, Jesus versus Caesar, subtitled tongue-in-cheek, for people tired of serving the wrong God. That's all about conversion there. So thanks.
Thank you, Joerg. Wow. You've given us so much to think about, and it's really inspiring. We're so glad you're out there doing this important work, and thank you.